My name is Maren Whitlock. Have you ever noticed how the biggest shifts in your life never actually announce themselves with a roar? They don't come with a warning siren or a dramatic clap of thunder. Most of the time, the truth just creeps in on a random, completely ordinary evening when you're doing something as mundane as wiping down a kitchen counter or putting away the groceries. It catches you completely off guard, not because it's loud, but because it's so terrifyingly quiet. If you're sitting down with a cup of coffee right now, I want you to take a second and really think about this. Have you ever looked back at a moment in your life and realized that a single tiny second was the exact boundary line between who you used to be and who you were forced to become? If you've ever had to take a deep breath and completely freeze your own emotions just to survive a sudden shift under your own roof, you'll understand exactly what I mean. It was a crisp, damp Tuesday evening in mid-October, the kind of Michigan autumn night where the chill starts to seep through the window panes, and the air smells like wet leaves and wood smoke. Down in the basement workshop, I could hear the steady, distant hum of my husband David's power tools. He was working on a custom cabinets project, a hobby he always retreated to when his corporate job as an executive vice president got too demanding. The rhythm of that hum had been the background noise of my life for over 2 decades. It was a comforting sound, a sound that meant everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. I was standing at the granite kitchen island, rubbing a bit of lavender hand cream into my palms after finishing the dinner dishes. The kitchen was warm, still holding the faint, rich scent of the roasted garlic chicken I'd made for dinner. Everything felt entirely normal. And then the family iPad, which was sitting casually right next to the fruit bowl, lit up with a soft, bright glow. I wasn't snooping. I have never been the kind of woman who hunts through her husband's things or checks his pockets. Trust was just the air we breathed in this house. But the screen stayed illuminated, displaying a clear preview notification from a luxury boutique jeweler downtown. The text read, "Thank you for your order, David. Your solid sterling silver signature link bracelet is ready for pickup. A confirmation receipt has been sent to julia.vancesels@gmail.com. My breath caught in my throat. My hands, still slick with lavender cream, froze entirely mid-motion. I stared at the glowing glass screen as the notification slowly faded into the background. Julia Vance. I knew that name. She was the regional marketing director at David's firm. A sharp, incredibly polished woman in her late 30s, whom I had greeted politely at least half a dozen corporate dinners. But it wasn't just the name that made my chest tighten into a hard, painful knot. It was the item, a solid sterling silver signature link bracelet. Just last month, on the morning of my 47th birthday, I woke up to find a small, beautifully wrapped silver box sitting on my dressing table. Inside, it was a sterling silver necklace. It was elegant, beautiful, and expensive. I remember tearing up, hugging David tightly around the neck while he smiled his characteristically calm, reassuring smile, telling me I deserved the finer things in life. I had worn that necklace to every single social event since, feeling cherished, feeling chosen. But staring at that iPad screen under the bright, sterile kitchen lights, the illusion didn't just crack. It shattered into a million tiny, jagged pieces. David hadn't bought me that silver box out of a sudden burst of romance or deep appreciation for our 24 years of marriage. He had bought it as a shield. It was a secondary, calculated purchase designed to alleviate the guilt of buying the exact same luxury brand for another woman. It was a bribe for my silence before I even knew there was anything to be silent about. I lowered myself slowly onto the leather bar stool, my legs suddenly feeling like water. The steady hum of the power tools continued from the basement, completely unchanged. The grandfather clock in the hallway kept its heavy, rhythmic ticking. The world was moving forward, but inside my mind, everything had stopped. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window, and for the first time in my life, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me. She looked entirely calm, her eyes steady, but underneath that surface, The first cold sparks of a total transformation were beginning to take hold. I sat there on that bar stool for what felt like an eternity, the lavender scent on my skins suddenly turning my stomach. I didn't run down to the basement. I didn't scream. If you've ever found yourself in a position where your entire reality shifts in a single second, you know that your brain does this strange thing. It reaches backward, desperately, trying to find the moment where the tracks misaligned. You start replaying the tape, looking for the exact turning point. David and I had been married for 24 years. We were the couple that everyone in our leafy suburban neighborhood in Michigan pointed to as the gold standard. We had built our life brick by careful brick. When we first started out, we had absolutely nothing. I still remember the living room floor of our tiny, cramped starter apartment. We couldn't afford a dining table, so we ate cheap Chinese takeout, straight out of the cardboard cartons, sitting cross-legged on the carpet. David looked across at me, his eyes bright with ambition, and whispered, "No matter how big we make it, Marin, we do this together. Always an open book." That memory felt like a ghost haunting my own kitchen. We had transitioned from that apartment to a beautiful 4-bedroom colonial house. We raised 2 incredible children, Nolan and Briar. I had poured every single ounce of my youth, my energy, and my intellect into supporting David's meteoric rise up the corporate ladder. I was the one who managed the household, coordinated the schedules, hosted the flawless networking dinners, and ensured his life was entirely frictionless so he could focus on becoming the executive vice president of his firm. But over the last few years, a subtle, cold shift had occurred. David hadn't changed by becoming explosive or overtly distant. No, he was far too intelligent and precise for that. He treated our marriage like a corporation, and he treated me like a highly efficient department manager. He was always polite, always punctual, always checking in, but it was entirely transactional. I want to pause right here and ask you a real question. If you're listening to this, type the word boundaries in the comments right now if you have ever realized that you became so efficient at managing your life that the people around you forgot you actually had feelings. There is a deeply painful difference between being useful to a man and being wanted by him. For years, I was incredibly useful. I was the anchor of his reality. But looking at that iPad screen, I realized that while I was busy maintaining the infrastructure of his life, he was out looking for someone to make him feel alive. Julia Vance didn't know the man who couldn't find his own socks, or the man who stressed over quarterly taxes. She got the polished, successful executive. I had built the monument, and she was stepping in to enjoy the courtyard. The tools in the basement suddenly went silent. The sudden absence of the hum made my heart take a hard, heavy thud against my ribs. I heard his heavy, confident footsteps moving toward the basement stairs, the door opening, and David walking into the kitchen. He was wiping a layer of sawdust from his forearms, looking exactly like the dependable, masculine husband I thought I knew. "Hey," he said, offering a casual, warm smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Just finishing up the base frames. What are you up to?" I looked at him, my gaze resting on the small lines around his blue eyes. My thumb instinctively covered the screen of the iPad, hiding the notification that had already burned itself into my memory. My voice came out entirely level, a shocking contrast to the absolute tempest raging inside my chest. "Just thinking about the kids," I said softly, giving him nothing but a gentle nod, "and how quiet the house is going to be soon." He chuckled, walking over to the refrigerator to grab a bottle of water. While Briar's graduation is just around the corner, we knew this day would come. It's just the natural progression of things, Marin. New chapters. There it was. That corporate, sanitized language he always used to describe major life shifts. New chapters, natural progression. He spoke as if our life was a slide deck presented at a board meeting. As he turned his back to me to take a sip of water, a wave of profound clarity washed over me. An average woman would have thrown the iPad at his feet. An average woman would have demanded answers right then and there, unleashing a torrent of hurt and tears. But I looked at the long, elegant lines of our granite island, and I realized something vital. If I reacted with emotion, David would deploy his corporate crisis management training. He would gaslight me, minimize it, delete the evidence, and rewrite the narrative before the morning sun hit the windows. He was a master of strategy. If I wanted to survive this with my dignity and my future intact, I couldn't afford to be emotional. I needed to become a strategist myself. I needed to let him believe his mask was perfectly intact, while I quietly dismantled everything he thought he controlled. The next few days were an exercise in absolute discipline. If you've ever had to sit across the breakfast table from someone, pour their coffee, and ask them how they slept, all while knowing a devastating secret about them, then you know the sheer mental bandwidth it takes to keep your face completely blank. You become an actor in your own life. Every tilt of your head, every smile, every casual "have a good day at work" is a rehearsed line. But I carried myself with a quiet dignity, refusing to let a single crack show in my composure. I knew I needed to wait for the right moment to look deeper, and that opportunity came exactly 10 days later. David had a routine weekend corporate golf trip up in northern Michigan, an annual event where the executives supposedly talked strategy while hitting balls on a manicured green. Normally, I would spend that Friday evening packing his favorite polo shirts, ensuring his travel bag was perfectly organized. This time, I did it with the same flawless execution, kissing his cheek as he loaded his car in the driveway. "Don't wait up on Sunday night, honey," he said, adjusting his sunglasses as the engine idled. "The dinner after the final round always runs late." "Take your time," I replied, forcing a soft, supportive smile. "Enjoy the weather." The second his black sedan cleared the edge of our driveway, the air in the house changed. It felt lighter, yet charged with a sudden, cold purpose. I walked back inside, locked the front door, and walked straight into the kitchen. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea, sat down at the island, and pulled out my laptop. The time for guessing was over. It was time for data. Because we had been married for nearly a quarter of a century, our digital footprints were entirely intertwined. I had the master passwords to our shared cloud storage, our joint bank accounts, and our investment portfolios. I had set them up years ago to keep our household running smoothly. David was a man who prided himself on his corporate intellect, but his arrogance was his blind spot. He assumed that because I had been a supportive housewife for so long, I lacked the analytical skills to decode his professional world. He was wrong. I started by pulling up our joint primary checking account, exporting the last 2 years of statements into a spreadsheet. At first glance, everything looked completely standard. Mortgage payments, country club dues, grocery runs, utilities. But as I began filtering the transactions by custom amounts, a specific pattern caught my eye. Every single month, on the 16th, a wire transfer of exactly $1,250 went out from our secondary joint savings account to an entity listed as Vance Harbor Consulting, LLC. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Vance. There was that name again, sitting quietly in our financial records like a ghost in the family ledger. I opened a separate browser window and began searching the Michigan Department of Licensing and Regulatory Affairs database. It took less than 10 minutes of digging through public corporate filings to find the initial formation paperwork for Vance Harbor Consulting, LLC. I zoomed in on the PDF document on my screen. The registered agent listed for the company wasn't Julia Vance. David was far too calculated to make a mistake that obvious. Instead, the registered agent was listed as a woman named Eleanor Hayes, whom a quick cross-reference on social media revealed to be Julia Vance's biological sister, using her married name. The corporate address for the LLC was a small private mailbox facility just 3 miles from David's office building. I sat back in my chair, the tea growing cold beside me. This wasn't a sudden, passionate mistake born out of a late night at the office. This was a structured, recurring financial arrangement. David was funneling our marital assets, money that belonged to our family, money meant for our children's futures, into a shell corporation controlled by his mistress's family. Every single month, while I was balancing our grocery budget and ensuring our home was a sanctuary for him, he was quietly paying a premium to maintain a secondary reality. I didn't cry. The betrayal sank deeper into my bones, turning from a burning hurt into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I pulled out my phone, lined up the laptop screen perfectly in the frame, and began taking crisp, clear photographs of every single wire transfer, every corporate filing, and every monthly statement. I saved the files to a brand new encrypted email account that David didn't even know existed. If you've ever had to document your own heartbreak just to protect your future, you know that each click of the camera shutter feels like a small, quiet victory over the lies. I was no longer just a wife waiting for her husband to come home from a golf trip. I was a woman building a case. Finding those monthly wire transfers was just the first layer of dirt. The real shock came when I managed to log into David's personal cloud backup later that night. I knew his security questions by heart. They were based on the name of his first childhood dog and the street he grew up on. It took me 3 tries, but when the screen finally loaded, I found myself looking at a folder hidden deep inside a directory titled Corporate Logistics. Inside it sat a single, password-protected spreadsheet, chillingly titled 10-Year Outlook. I guessed the password on the first attempt. It was the coordinates of our lake house lot, a place he always claimed represented his ultimate peace. When the file opened, my heart dropped into my stomach. It wasn't a business document. It was a meticulously laid out financial timeline detailing the gradual liquidation of our shared marital assets. David had mapped out a strategic multi-year exit plan designed to drain our joint investments and systematically deflate my potential alimony pool, all timed perfectly to the month our youngest daughter, Briar, was scheduled to graduate from college. I closed my eyes as a memory hit me like a physical blow. Just a year ago, at Briar's high school graduation ceremony, the stadium was packed and loud. David had reached over, wrapped his arm tightly around my shoulders, and pulled me close. He leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, and whispered, "We did it, Marin. The hardest years of building are finally behind us. Now it's just about coasting into the future together." At the time, those words had filled me with a deep, emotional warmth. Now, looking at the glowing rows of data on the spreadsheet, I realized that very day was listed as Phase 1 baseline in his exit strategy. While I was shedding tears of pride for our daughter, my husband was using that milestone as the green light to start siphoning away our life savings. He had calculated exactly how much money he could move into the Vance Harbor Consulting LLC each quarter without triggering an automatic audit from our bank. He had even drafted a mock separation agreement in his characteristically neat, architecturally precise handwriting, noting at the bottom, "Marin will default to emotional compliance if handled quietly. Maintain standard domestic routines to prevent premature discovery." I leaned back, staring blankly at the screen as the heavy significance of what I was reading settled over me. I want to take a slow, deep breath right here with you, because if you've ever listened to a story like this, or lived through a moment where you realized the person sleeping next to you was actively engineering your downfall, you know the absolute numbness that sets in. It is an agonizing feeling. He hadn't just stumbled into an emotional affair because he was lonely or having a midlife crisis. He had mathematically choreographed my disposal while smiling at the dinner table, eating the food I cooked, and letting me wash his clothes. He was treating our entire life together as a liability he needed to offload with minimal financial damage to himself. He wanted to walk away with his corporate reputation intact, his pockets full of our joint savings, and his shiny new relationship perfectly lined up, leaving me with an empty house and a depleted bank account. But his absolute reliance on data and timelines was about to become his biggest mistake. He had written down his entire blueprint of deception, and in doing so, he had handed me the exact keys I needed to lock him out of his own narrative. The next Monday morning, the very minute David stepped onto the elevator at his corporate headquarters, I was sitting in a quiet, sunlit office downtown. I hadn't called my friends to vent, and I hadn't posted anything vague on social media. Instead, I sought out Evelyn Thorne, a no-nonsense family law attorney who specialized in high-asset protection, alongside a seasoned forensic accountant named Marcus Vance. Ironically, no relation to Julia, though the coincidence felt like a cosmic wink. Evelyn sat across from me, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, wire-rimmed glasses resting on the bridge of her nose, as she reviewed the encrypted files I had compiled. She didn't offer empty platitudes or generic expressions of sympathy. She just looked up at me with a calm, measured gaze that instantly made me feel grounded. "Marin," she said, tapping her pen against the printed copy of David's 10-year Outlook spreadsheet. "Your husband is an incredibly precise man, but his arrogance is his fatal flaw. In his mind, he was running a flawless corporate restructuring. But in a court of law, this isn't restructuring, it's premeditated dissipation of marital assets. By documenting his explicit intent to drain your joint accounts before filing for divorce, he has completely handed us his leverage on a silver platter." Marcus, the accountant, nodded in absolute agreement. "Because he routed everything through a traceable shell corporation, we don't have to guess where the money went. His digital trail of intent is so pristine that it effectively destroys his legal defense. We can freeze these accounts before he even realizes you've seen the ledger." The strategy they laid out required an immense amount of emotional fortitude from me. Evelyn's instructions were clear. "Play the long game, Marin. Let him think his plan is working flawlessly. The more secure a logical man feels, the more careless he becomes." For the next 3 weeks, I performed the role of my life. I maintained our standard domestic routines with absolute mechanical perfection. I cooked his favorite garlic herb salmon, asked him about his quarterly projections, and listened to him talk about his day. It was chilling to watch him drop subtle, manipulative hints to our children over Sunday dinners, casually mentioning that Mom might prefer a simpler, smaller lifestyle on her own in a few years, or that maintaining a big house like this is getting to be too much stress for your mother. He was actively trying to rewrite my character, painting me as the fragile, unstable wife who needed to be quietly phased out of the family equation. But each time he spoke, I simply took a slow sip of water, looked him dead in the eye, and smiled. I wasn't losing my mind. I was letting him build his own trap. The perfect room doesn't find you. You have to orchestrate it. And the opportunity to present the absolute truth arrived 3 weeks later. David had just secured a massive corporate promotion to senior executive vice president, and his firm wanted to celebrate. Because he loved showing off our beautiful home as a testament to his success, he insisted we host an intimate, high-profile welcome home and celebration dinner party right at our house. "We need the full corporate board there, Marin," he told me that morning as he adjusted his luxury watch in front of the mirror. "All the senior partners, our closest neighbors, and of course, the kids. It's important we present a flawless, united front for the company's stakeholders." "Of course, David," I replied, smoothing down the lapel of his blazer with a gentle, reassuring touch. "I'll make sure everything looks absolutely unforgettable." Inside, my heart was perfectly steady. This was exactly the room my attorney had spoken about. I spent the entire day preparing with meticulous, cold precision. I set the dining table with our finest crystal, arranged gorgeous autumn centerpieces, and prepared a multi-course gourmet dinner. But my primary focus was on the entryway table. Using our home office printer, I had compiled the most damning pieces of evidence from my investigation: the forensic accounting logs, the clear screenshots of the Vance Harbor Consulting LLC bank transfers, the corporate filings showing Julia Vance's sister as the agent, and a beautifully enlarged copy of his handwritten 10-year Outlook exit strategy timeline. I bound these documents neatly into sleek, professional midnight blue folders, placing them in a crisp row right next to the guest sign-in book. To anyone walking in, they looked exactly like commemorative company portfolios, detailing the history of David's career milestones. By 7 o'clock, the house was filled with the lively chatter of 25 high-profile guests, the clinking of champagne flutes, and classical music playing softly in the background. Julia Vance was there, looking as elegant and polished as ever in a deep emerald dress, mingling effortlessly with the board members. Our adult children, Nolan and Briar, had also flown in for the weekend, smiling proudly at their father. David was in his absolute element, tall, distinguished, and entirely confident as he commanded the center of the living room. Halfway through the evening, David stood near the grand fireplace and tapped his glass to call for a toast. The room grew quiet, all eyes turning toward him. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," David began, his voice warm and resonating with practiced corporate charm. "This promotion is a huge milestone, but I could never have achieved this level of success without the unwavering structural support of my incredible wife, Marin. She has been the quiet anchor of my life, keeping our home frictionless so I could focus on building our future." Polite applause rippled through the room. Julia Vance raised her glass with a tight, knowing smile. I stood at the edge of the dining room, hands folded gracefully in front of my dress, feeling the absolute weight of the moment. David looked across the room at me, his eyes filled with a terrifyingly calculated sense of relief. He truly believed his narrative was locked in. He believed he was gracefully transitioning into a new chapter, leaving me behind while keeping his reputation pristine. I walked calmly to the center of the room, my heels clicking measuredly against the hardwood floor. The applause died down, the guests turning to me expectantly, assuming I was about to give a traditional, supportive wife's speech. "Thank you, David," I said, my voice completely clear, calm, and conversational. It carried effortlessly through the sudden silence of the house. "Before we celebrate your new chapter, I think the people in this room deserve to see the exact blueprint of how you planned it." David's smile froze. A subtle flicker of panic crossed his features, but he quickly tried to maintain his composure. "Marin, honey, if this is a joke—" "It's no joke," I interrupted evenly, turning my gaze to the corporate board members. "If you take a look at the midnight blue folders on the entryway table, you'll find the complete operational history of Vance Harbor Consulting, LLC. You'll see exactly how joint family funds were systematically siphoned into a shell corporation tied directly to your regional marketing director's family. And most importantly, you'll see a document written in my husband's own hand, titled 10-Year Outlook, which explicitly details his strategy to deflate my assets and wait until our daughter graduated to push me out." A collective, sharp gasp rippled through the ballroom. Two of the senior board members immediately turned and walked toward the entryway, picking up the folders. Within seconds, the rustle of turning pages filled the absolute deafening silence of the room. Julia Vance's face went entirely pale, her glass shaking slightly in her hand. David took a hard step toward me, his hands clenching at his sides, his pristine corporate mask completely cracking in real time. "Marin, you are clearly emotional and under an immense amount of stress right now," David muttered, forcing a tight, defensive corporate smile as he tried to grab my arm. "This is a private family matter." I stepped back gracefully, looking him dead in the eye without a single ounce of fear. "No, David, I was emotional 3 weeks ago when I found the silver box. Tonight, I am documented. You chose this room to talk about our future, so I simply ensured the room finally knew the truth." Nolan walked over, his face pale with shock, placing a protective hand on my shoulder while Briar stood beside him, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the printed spreadsheet in a guest's hand. The logical executive, who had spent 3 years mathematically planning my disposal, stood entirely alone in the center of his own living room, completely stripped of his script, with absolutely nothing left to say. The absolute silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard in my life. One by one, the corporate board members quietly set their champagne flutes down on the tables. There were no dramatic scenes, no shouting matches, and no ridiculous theatrics. When you present an elite group of professionals with absolute, undeniable forensic data, they don't argue, they evaluate. Within 15 minutes, the coats were retrieved from the closet. Hurried and uncomfortable murmurs of goodbye were exchanged, and the front door opened and shut until the house was completely empty. Julia Vance had slipped out the side door the very second the first folder was opened, leaving David to face the ruins of his pristine reputation entirely on his own. David stood near the fireplace, his broad shoulders slumped, looking older than he ever had. He looked at the bound blue folders scattered on the tables, then looked at me. For 24 years, he had been the master narrator of our life, but tonight his script was completely gone. "We need to talk," he said, his voice a hollow, defeated whisper. I picked up my small clutch purse from the kitchen island, my movements slow, fluid, and incredibly calm. "We will talk, David, but not tonight, and only through Evelyn Thorne. Tonight, you need to pack a suitcase and leave." He didn't fight me. His logic, the very tool he had used to try and dismantle my life, told him that he had zero leverage left. He packed a single bag in total, humiliated silence and drove away into the dark Michigan night to find a temporary corporate apartment. When the taillights of his car finally disappeared past the edge of the driveway, I walked out onto the back porch. The rain had stopped, and the crisp, clean autumn air filled my lungs. Nolan and Briar came out and sat beside me on the porch steps. Briar wrapped her arms around my waist, burying her face into my shoulder, while Nolan squeezed my hand tight. "I'm so sorry we didn't see it, Mom," Nolan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We thought he was just being stressed with work." I kissed the top of his head, looking out at the dark silhouette of the maple tree in our yard. "You don't need to apologize for his choices, sweetheart. We see the truth now, and that's all that matters." "You didn't embarrass us tonight, Mom," Briar whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "He did. I've never seen anyone stay as strong as you just did." Those words from my children healed something incredibly deep inside my soul. A raw, hidden space I hadn't even realized was bleeding. The divorce took a long time to finalize, but because we held the pristine documentation of his asset siphoning, the court lines were drawn with absolute clarity. I didn't destroy him. I simply let the truth do its work. Now, it's a beautiful, quiet morning. I am sitting on my back porch with a hot cup of coffee, watching the morning sun filter through the amber leaves. The house is completely mine now. Not because I won a bitter, vengeful victory, but because I chose honesty over compliance. I want to leave you with one final thought over this cup of coffee. Staying calm doesn't mean you are weak, and it doesn't mean you are passive. Sometimes keeping your composure is the ultimate act of power. It allows you to gather your strength in the dark, so that when you finally step into the light, the truth does all the heavy lifting for you. You stop being a secondary character in someone else's calculated plan, and you finally become the author of your own freedom. Thank you so much for sitting with me today and listening to my story. If this journey touched your heart, please leave a comment down below and tell me exactly where in the world you are listening from. If you have ever had to find your voice and stay strong while your whole world was shifting, I want you to know that you are never alone. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so we can keep walking through these real, raw, and hopeful moments together. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next story.